A slab of black basalt sits above a tide line, its surface salted white, its edges shaved flat by wind. It does not look important. It looks like one more stone on one more coast, cold, dense, ordinary. And that is exactly the kind of object ancient texts keep using when they want to hide something in plain sight. By the 4th century, official church authorities had already pushed the Book of Jubilees outside the books most believers would ever hear read aloud. It carried a rival calendar, a stricter structure of sacred time, a record of revelation that did not stay safely inside Genesis and Exodus. So it was edged out, then ignored, then treated as if it had always belonged somewhere else. That would have been the end of it if copies had not kept surfacing in places nobody expected. Ethiopian manuscripts preserved it whole. Then fragments appeared among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, not as a stray curiosity, but in multiple copies, enough to show this was not a fringe text drifting at the edge of memory. It had weight, it had readers, it had authority. And once those fragments were compared against the later Ge'ez tradition and the older English translations, a pattern became harder to dismiss. The pattern is this: Jubilees preserves a geography of judgment, boundary, and inscription that later readers understood as pointing to a hidden island where divine record and divine sentence meet. In the next several minutes, you'll see what the text says, what the evidence shows, and why it was hidden. If lost scripture and erased sacred geography fascinate you, hit subscribe. Every week, we uncover what was removed from scripture. But here's what makes this stranger. The Book of Jubilees does not read like loose speculation. It presents itself as revelation delivered to Moses on Sinai over 40 days and 40 nights. It opens with stone tablets. It moves immediately into divisions of years, laws, witnesses, and records written before human history is fully underway. In chapter 1, Moses is told not only to receive law, but to receive the earlier and later history of the world, already structured, already ordered, already written. In chapter 4, Enoch becomes the first human being said to learn writing and wisdom, the first to record the signs of heaven, the cycles of months, the Sabbaths of years, and testimony for future generations. In chapter 8, the earth is divided by lot, with named territories, mountains, seas, and islands. In the surviving Hebrew fragments from Qumran, catalogued across manuscripts, scholars number 4Q216 through 4Q224, that framework is not softened, it is reinforced. James Vanderkam spent decades tracing that textual continuity. R.H. Charles, despite his age and limitations, recognized early that Jubilees was obsessed with sequence, division, and inscribed order. This is not background detail. This is the machinery of the text, and this is where it gets disturbing. What we're looking at breaks into 4 parts. Part 1 is the record itself. Jubilees 1 does not describe revelation as a passing voice. It describes a written system. Moses is summoned to receive stone tablets. The angel of the presence is told to write from the beginning of creation onward. And then comes the phrase that matters, the tables of the divisions of the years. Not just memory, not just prophecy. Tables, divisions, order. This is record language, administrative language, archive language. The text treats heaven as a place where events are not merely known. They are inscribed. They are arranged in units. They are stored in a pattern that can be consulted, transmitted, and enforced. That matters because once judgment is attached to writing, judgment is no longer abstract. It has location, it has custody, it has witnesses. Part 2 is the witness on earth. In Jubilees 4, Enoch is described as the first among men to learn writing and knowledge and wisdom. He writes the signs of heaven. He sets in order the months. He recounts the Sabbaths of the years. He sees what was and what will be, and he places his testimony on earth for future generations. That is a remarkable move. The book does not keep the heavenly record purely above. It says a version of that witness is deposited below. A copy, a testimony, something terrestrial that corresponds to something celestial. And the same chapter closes with a statement most readers slide past too quickly. The Lord has 4 places on the earth: Garden of Eden, the Mount of the East, Mount Sinai, Mount Zion. 4 places. Not infinite sacredness spread everywhere. 4 fixed points. 4 controlled sites. The text is narrowing the map. Part 3 is the geography. Jubilees 8 and 9 divide the earth among the sons of Noah by lot, not vaguely, but with named rivers, mountains, coastlines, and islands. Shem's territory includes the middle of the earth, Eden, lands by the Red Sea, distant eastern regions, and the islands of Kaftur. Japheth's portion stretches northward and includes 5 great islands. This is not decoration. It means the writer thinks in bounded zones, marked inheritance, and sacred allocation. If a place matters, it belongs somewhere precise, even if later readers cannot perfectly reconstruct the map. And that is where the island reading begins. Not because Jubilees says, in one clean sentence, here is the invisible island. It does something more ancient and more difficult. It scatters the coordinates. It gives you sacred places, written judgments, boundary lots, and island allotments inside one system. Then it leaves the listener to understand that some zones are not open terrain. They are reserved. Part 4 is judgment. Jubilees uses the language of witness and recompense constantly. Sin is written down. Law is written down. Times are written down. Murder is condemned in language tied to what is written on heavenly tablets. Apostasy leads to captivity because the testimony already stands against the people. This is not a text where heaven casually observes. It is a text where heaven records first and judges from the record. So when later readers speak of judgment stones, they are not inventing the stone element out of nowhere. The book begins on Sinai with stone tablets, structures history as inscribed divisions, and locates sacred authority in fixed earthly places. Stone, in this system, is not symbolic wallpaper. Stone is the medium of permanence. A thing cut into stone is not suggestion. It is sentence. Now put those 4 parts back together in sequence. Written heavenly archive, earthly witness placed by Enoch, sacred geography narrowed to discrete locations, judgment attached to what is written. Once you do that, the later claim starts to make sense. The hidden island is not hidden because the text forgot to be specific. It is hidden because the text treats certain locations as restricted nodes between earthly terrain and heavenly record. Invisible, in that reading, means withheld from ordinary traffic, not absent from matter. That is why the island detail matters. Not because it sounds dramatic, because it solves a structural problem in the text. If heaven keeps record, and if earth holds corresponding witnesses, and if the most dangerous material is attached to judgment, where does that contact point sit? Not in a crowded city, not in a public court. In the ancient imagination, it sits off the main routes, at the edge, guarded by distance, weather, taboo, and incomplete coordinates. The old coast traditions around sacred islands work exactly that way. You can see the shore. You still do not arrive. You know the direction. you still do not cross. Visitors are kept away by more than water. They are kept away by category. They do not belong to the place, so the place does not disclose itself. This is why the physical image matters. A basalt slab on a coast is not random scenery. It is a boundary object, hard enough to hold an inscription, dark enough to disappear at dusk, stable enough to outlast memory. Modern readers sometimes miss that because they want one explicit line. They want a confession sentence. They want the text to tell them directly that there is an island and stones and judgment and a reason nobody gets close. Jubilees does not work that way. Second Temple texts often build meaning by accumulation, repeated terms, recurring structures, geographical narrowing, deposited witness, fixed lots. If you flatten that into a summary, the machinery vanishes. That machinery starts looking even less accidental when you compare it to modern work on remote insular sanctuaries and navigational exclusion zones. Over the last decade, archaeologists and landscape historians studying island ritual sites have kept returning to the same pattern. Sacred places on small offshore landmasses are often marked less by monumental architecture than by access restriction, unusual rock surfaces, exposed coastal platforms, and traditions that frame approach as conditional. In 2021 and 2023, teams working across Mediterranean and North Atlantic ritual landscapes showed how visibility and reachability are not the same thing. A place can be seen from shore and still function as hidden if tides, currents, rock shelves, fog belts, or inherited taboo block ordinary entry. That does not prove Jubilees names a modern island we can point to on a tourist map. But it does confirm the logic. Ancient writers regularly tied judgment, oath, or divine record to hard coastal stone and controlled approach. The island is not absurd. It is historically legible. Here's what the translators left out. In many casual summaries of Jubilees, the phrase in Chapter 1 is reduced to something like a sacred chronology or a history of Jubilees. That sounds harmless. It sounds almost clerical. But the sharper wording in the older textual tradition is the tables of the divisions of the years. Tables, divisions. The difference matters. Chronology is a topic. Tables are objects. Divisions are allocations. Once that phrase is softened, readers stop seeing the text as an archive and start seeing it as a sermon. The same flattening happens when Chapter 4 is paraphrased as Enoch learned wisdom. That is not all it says. It says he learned writing, recorded the signs of heaven, and placed testimony on earth. And when Chapter 8 is summarized as a distribution of lands after the flood, the islands disappear into a blur of biblical geography. But the islands are there, the lots are there, the sacred places are there. Translation does not only change words, it changes what a reader thinks the text is doing. If you keep the sharper phrasing, the whole structure tightens. Heaven uses tables. Earth receives testimony. Sacred authority is fixed in select places. Islands belong inside the map of inheritance. Judgment proceeds from what is already written. That is not vague mysticism. It is an organized system. The suppression starts at the Council of Laodicea in the 4th century. That is not because bishops met and said the name Jubilees with panic. Suppression is often quieter than that. The council narrowed what could be publicly read. Then Athanasius, in 367, issued his festal list and stabilized another set of boundaries around acceptable books. Jerome pushed hard for the authority of the Hebrew canon as he understood it. Later Western catalogs repeated the pattern. By the time the Gelasian tradition was circulating in late antique and early medieval Latin Christianity, Books outside the approved stream could be named, sidelined, and inherited as suspect. Jubilees was especially vulnerable because it did not merely add a colorful episode here or there. It preserved a different architecture of time, a stricter calendar, a louder angelic transmission chain, a more explicit theology of written heavenly order. It also circulated in communities that were no longer setting the rules for the imperial church. So the book survived unevenly, not erased everywhere, not destroyed in every form, but narrowed, displaced, and cut off from mainstream reading habits. Ethiopia kept it. Qumran had already shown it once had wide authority. The later Mediterranean church largely did not. That is how suppression usually works in text history. First the reading stops, then copying contracts, then commentary dries up, then a later age mistakes absence for irrelevance. Now, here's where it gets active. In the last several years, the public has watched repeated battles over scroll fragments, access, provenance, and controlled publication. In 2020, the Museum of the Bible announced that all of its supposed Dead Sea Scroll fragments were modern forgeries after scientific review. That scandal was not about Jubilees alone, but it exposed something crucial. Whoever controls fragments, testing, imaging, and release controls the story the public hears. At the same time, access to caves, fragile holdings, and unpublished materials remains tightly managed for obvious reasons, and sometimes opaque ones. Images appear in batches. Technical findings arrive through institutions, not open rumor. Provenance files are incomplete more often than viewers realize. So when people ask why the public picture still feels partial, the answer is simple. The material is real, the archive is fragmented, and gatekeeping never stopped. It just became professionalized. That matters for a text like Jubilees, because the book lives in reconstruction. No single surviving Hebrew codex sits on a table and settles every dispute. What we have is a chain: Qumran fragments, later Ethiopic preservation, translation history, and editorial decisions. That is exactly the kind of environment in which certain readings survive quietly, while public religion moves on without them. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying there is a secret modern government outpost guarding a glowing island of supernatural stones in the middle of the sea. But what the text describes, when you look at it carefully, matches a far older pattern: heavenly record mirrored in earthly witness. Sacred territory broken into fixed lots, judgment attached to inscribed order, and access limited by place, category, and preservation. That is enough to explain why later readers kept seeing an island in the structure, even when the surviving manuscripts never hand them a clean modern map pin. And once you see that, another detail falls into place. The island is not kept from visitors merely by force. It is kept from them by unreadability. The map is incomplete. The terms are softened. The sacred places are reduced to scenery. The archive is scattered across languages. That is a stronger barrier than a wall. People can stand right next to the evidence and still not recognize what it is. What we have to confront is the simplest explanation that fits the evidence. If Jubilees repeatedly frames heaven as a written archive, then its judgments are meant to be recorded, not improvised. If Enoch is said to place testimony on earth for future generations, then the text expects terrestrial witnesses to sacred knowledge, not purely invisible revelation. If the book narrows divine geography to a small number of fixed places and explicitly distributes islands by lot, then remote insular sacred space belongs inside its world, not outside it. If later canon makers consistently preferred versions of sacred history with less of this machinery visible, then the disappearance of these readings is easier to explain as contraction than as coincidence. And if the surviving fragments from Qumran show that Jubilees once mattered enough to be copied again and again, then the material was treated as documentation by real communities long before later readers were taught to look away from it. That leaves us with a conclusion most people resist because it sounds too severe. The book is not speaking in loose symbols and private inspiration alone. It is preserving an administrative vision of the cosmos. Records above, copies below, boundaries fixed, judgment stored, access limited. In that kind of world, a hidden island holding judgment stones is not fantasy language. It is the natural endpoint of the system. A slab of black basalt sits above a tide line, its surface salted white, its edges shaved flat by wind. It is still there, still taking salt, still dark at the waterline, still looking ordinary enough to be missed, exactly the way a boundary stone is supposed to look when the people passing it were never meant to know what it marks.